The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song above Cedar Creek Medical's ICU bay, a sound that had become as familiar to Natalie Hayes as her own heartbeat. She moved through the medication room at 0630, restocking supplies with the precision of someone who understood that hesitation in emergencies meant death. For bags. Trauma shears. Sterile gauze in ascending sizes. Each item placed exactly where muscle memory could find it in darkness or chaos, or the kind of controlled panic that came with a code blue at 3 in the morning. Her hands moved like instruments, economical and certain. A nurse passing through the doorway paused. "You're fast," she said, almost a question, watching Natalie thread a fresh line of tubing through the rapid infuser brackets. Natalie didn't respond. She'd learned years ago that acknowledgement only invited conversation, and conversation invited the kind of attention she'd spent 5 years building a life to avoid. She simply nodded once, her jaw tight, and continued working. The nurse drifted away. Most of them did. Most people never stayed long enough to really see her. Natalie touched the edge of her left collarbone, where a scar traced the line of her clavicle like a map of a journey she'd taken with someone else's name attached to it. Her fingers were rough, calloused in specific places, the webbing between thumb and index finger, the pads of her middle fingers, the heel of her right hand. Hands that had held pressure on a subclavian artery while someone screamed. Hands that had threaded chest tubes in a rooftop position overlooking the Euphrates. Hands that had learned to be steady because the alternative was unacceptable. She finished her inventory and moved toward her locker, the one in the far corner of the break room, the one nobody else ever used. Her left leg pulled slightly as she walked, not quite a limp, just a favoring of her right side, the kind of compensation that had become so automatic after 18 months of physical therapy that most people never noticed. They saw a quiet nurse in her mid-40s moving through a hospital with unremarkable efficiency. They saw someone who clocked in, kept her head down, and clocked out without making waves. They saw exactly what she wanted them to see. The locker door opened. Inside, folded with military precision, lay a flag. Not displayed. Not honored in a shadow box the way it should have been. Folded small, the way it had come to her, pressed into her hands by the chaplain at Joint Base Ballard 4 years ago. The name of her second lieutenant remained unspoken. She whispered it anyway, the way she did every morning before her shift began, the way she had whispered it every morning for the past 1,461 days. Her fingers traced the folded fabric once. Just once. Then she closed the door and locked it. "Nurse Hayes." The voice came from behind her, smooth and measured like expensive leather. Natalie turned to find Dr. Marcus Mercer standing in the ICU bay entrance, his white coat pristine, his stethoscope draped around his neck with the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having needed to actually use it. His tablet was already open, his thumb scrolling through something with the focused intensity of a man who believed himself genuinely important. He looked up as though he'd just noticed her, though she knew he'd been watching for at least 30 seconds. "I'll need you on intake rotation today. The bay is running behind." "Understood, Doctor." Her voice came out flat, deferential, the way she'd trained herself to speak in environments where the hierarchy was visible and enforced. The way she'd learned to speak when she accepted erasure as the price of invisibility. He nodded, already turning away, then paused. His eyes had caught something, the precision of her movements in the medication room visible through the glass partition. She'd been suturing a minor laceration on a patient's arm, a task that should have taken 10 minutes but that she'd completed in 4. The stitches were perfect. Too perfect. Clinical. The kind of perfect that came from having done the same procedure thousands of times under circumstances where imperfection meant someone's child wouldn't be coming home. Dr. Mercer's gaze lingered on the suturing tray, on the placement of her hands, on the muscle memory that seemed to operate independently of conscious thought. Something flickered across his expression, not quite recognition, just an awareness that something didn't quite fit. He studied her face, searching for something he couldn't name. Natalie held his gaze with the flatness of someone with nothing to hide because she had already hidden everything that mattered. After a moment, he looked away. "Intake rotation," he said again, more to himself than to her. Don't make mistakes today. She returned to the ICU bay as the morning shift settled into its rhythm. 12-hour rotations meant the night crew was already thinking about exit routes, about the coffee they'd drink in their cars before driving home. The day crew was still caffeinated, still optimistic, still moving through their rounds with the energy that came from a full night of sleep. Natalie existed between both states, neither day nor night, neither visible nor invisible, simply present in the way a well-maintained piece of hospital equipment was present. She moved through her rounds with methodical efficiency. Vital signs. Medication administration. Chart updates. The kind of invisible work that kept people alive without anyone ever needing to know how it happened. An elderly woman in Bay 3 needed her foot repositioned. It had infiltrated during the night shift, leaving a small area of swelling around the catheter site. Natalie assessed it with a single glance, knowing exactly what she would need and exactly how long it would take. She worked quickly, speaking in low tones to the woman about her grandson, about the weather in Colorado Springs, about the kinds of things that people said to each other when they were trying to make difficult moments feel less difficult. The room next to her had been empty since 6 o'clock. It filled at 7:08 with a controlled chaos that signaled something serious. A stretcher. A patient who was barely conscious. A paramedic calling out vitals like a chant, transport time 32 minutes. Respiratory distress onset approximately 4 hours. Breath sounds diminished on the right. We've got him on 2 liters nasal cannula, oxygen sat holding at 86%. The man on the stretcher was dark-haired, lean, with the kind of posture that came from military training even in unconsciousness. His breathing was labored. Wrong. The kind of wrong that meant something had collapsed inside his chest cavity. Natalie registered his condition without changing her expression. Tension pneumothorax. The assessment came automatically, born from training that lived in her bones. The clinical name for what happened when the body turned against itself, when air accumulated in the space between lung and ribs, when each breath became a slower, more painful affair. The kind of injury she'd seen before. The kind she'd treated before, in a different lifetime, under different circumstances, with different names and different ranks and different rules. A nurse she didn't know began asking questions. What's his name? Do we have next of kin? Any allergies listed? The paramedics shrugged. They'd brought him in off the street, they said. Found him collapsed near the community center on Wasatch Avenue. No ID. No wallet. No indication of who he was or how long he'd been in distress. Natalie watched from the medication station as the patient was transferred to the bay, as monitors were placed, as the day shift went through its protocols. She saw his hand clench slightly as he was moved, a sign of consciousness, of awareness of pain, of the body trying to signal that something was profoundly wrong. She saw his eyes flutter open for just a moment, unfocused and confused. She saw the rise and fall of his chest become more shallow with each passing breath. And then she saw his eyes focus. Not on the nurses. Not on the monitors or the 4 lines or the mechanical apparatus of modern emergency medicine. On her. Across the bay, from his position on the stretcher, through the tangle of equipment and personnel, he was looking directly at her. His breathing was still labored. His condition was still deteriorating. But his eyes had found hers, and something in that moment shifted, a flicker of recognition, maybe, or the kind of awareness that came from having survived things together that had no official names. The afternoon moved forward. Hours that blurred into one another the way hospital hours did, where time became measured in vital signs rather than clock hands. Natalie continued her rounds. She changed dressings. She documented medication administration. She remained invisible, the way she'd trained herself to be, the way she'd accepted as the price of being allowed to help. She didn't approach the new patient's bay directly. That would have drawn attention. That would have created questions. She simply worked methodically through her assignment, moving through the hospital like water moving around stone. It was nearly 1600, near the end of her shift, when Torres called out softly as she passed his bay. His breathing had improved slightly, the initial crisis had stabilized, the way these things sometimes did when bodies were given time and oxygen and the right combination of medications. She paused outside his door, checking to ensure she was alone, that no one was watching, that this moment could exist in the privacy of a half-open doorway. "Nurse Hayes," he whispered, his voice hoarse but deliberate. "I know that suturing pattern. The placement. The tension. Who taught you combat surgical technique?" The question hung in the filtered afternoon light that came through the ICU windows. Outside, Colorado Springs was moving through its normal Thursday afternoon, unaware that the woman standing in a hospital doorway had once held that man's life in her hands in an entirely different context. She didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the patient in the hospital bed but the soldier she recognized from somewhere her official record said she'd never been. "Rest, Mr. Torres," she said finally, her voice still professionally neutral. "Dr. Mercer will want to see improvement in your breathing before discharge." But as she turned away, moving back into the fluorescent-lit corridors of Cedar Creek Medical, toward the medication room and the quiet corner of the break room where her shift would end in 45 minutes, she understood something had shifted. Someone here now knew that the quiet nurse with unremarkable credentials was something other than what her file suggested. Someone here was remembering her the way she'd been trained to forget herself. Dr. Mercer entered Torres's bay at 0945, his white coat crisp as fresh paper, his presence arriving before his words did. Natalie was adjusting the oxygen flow, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, not nursing school textbooks. Torres's daughter Maria sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed, her knuckles white where she gripped the armrest. "Perhaps someone with actual emergency medicine credentials should handle this," Mercer announced, his voice pitched to carry beyond the curtain. He didn't look at Natalie. He looked at Maria. "Your father deserves a physician's attention, not a nurse playing doctor." The words landed like a scalpel. Natalie felt them the way you feel a bullet passing close enough to part your hair, but her hands didn't flinch. The 4 lines she was checking remained steady. Her jaw clenched fractionally, just enough tension at the hinge to keep her teeth from grinding. Maria's face crumpled. What do you mean? She's not." "Your father is critical," Mercer said, stepping between Natalie and the bed with the casual authority of a man who'd never been told no. "He needs my expertise, not experimental improvisation. Nurse Hayes here sometimes forgets her place in the hierarchy." He turned to her then, and his smile was the smile of a man holding all the cards. "You're dismissed, Nightingale." The nickname struck her as intentional. Demeaning. The kind of thing a doctor says when he wants everyone in the room to understand that a nurse is ornamental, not essential. Natalie held his gaze for exactly one breath, the same breath she'd held while rounds of 7.62mm ammunition carved the air above a rooftop in Anbar Province, then she stepped back. She set the oxygen monitor on the bedside table with care, each movement controlled, each gesture empty of emotion. "Of course, doctor," she said quietly. Her voice never rose. It never wavered. She turned and walked out. Behind her, Maria was apologizing to her father for bringing the nice nurse back. Mercer was already examining Torres, his stethoscope moving with theatrical precision, his voice rising to fill the space Natalie had occupied. 2 days passed like a held breath. Natalie entered the break room on a Tuesday morning carrying her lunch in a thermal container, the same container she'd carried every day for 3 months, unremarkable, invisible. The room smelled of burnt coffee and the antiseptic tang of hospital-grade cleanser. 4 nurses sat at the center table in a cluster, Davidson from nights, Chen from pediatrics, Morrison from surgical, and Yates, who'd asked Natalie to cover her shift just 2 weeks earlier. The moment Natalie appeared in the doorway, all 4 of them stopped talking. Their eyes met in that fraction of a second, the kind of synchronized glance that happens when a predetermined signal has been given. They stood almost simultaneously, a choreography of retreat. Davidson gathered her sandwich. Chen closed her laptop. Morrison picked up her phone. Yates took a step toward the exit, her gaze deliberately pointed away from Natalie, the way you look past a piece of furniture that's in your path. Natalie stood in the doorway and watched them reconvene in the hallway just beyond the glass window. They clustered there, voices dropping to whispers, their body language speaking the language of exclusion. Chen glanced back once, her expression caught between pity and fear. Natalie sat down alone at the center table. She opened her thermal container. The sandwich inside was turkey and mustard, the edges already starting to curl. She bit into it and tasted nothing but the metallic echo of every bad decision her silence had ever protected. Through the window, she watched Mercer pass the break room. He didn't stop. He didn't need to. His eyes found hers through the glass, held for a single beat, and his smile was the smile of a surgeon who'd just made an incision exactly where he wanted. The next morning, a white printed notice appeared on the unit board in the main hallway. The header read, "Disciplinary Notice, Natalie Hayes, RN, Dangerous Improvisation." Staff clustered around it like bees to a corpse. Natalie watched from the medication station, her hand frozen on a syringe. The notice was 3 pages long. Mercer had documented 3 separate incidents, each with timestamps and witness statements. Asterisk performed advanced airway assessment beyond RN scope of practice. Patient was assessed by RN Hayes without physician consultation. Improper medication administration protocol observed. Asterisk each claim was carefully constructed, each witness name underlined with small red pen marks, his hand, his decision to weaponize the language of hospital policy. One of the nurses reading it, Patterson from the day shift, muttered something Natalie's ears caught before her mind processed it. "I heard she lied about her credentials." Another voice, lower, faked her nursing degree, "I think. That's why Mercer's investigating." Natalie's hands didn't shake. They didn't tremble. They continued their work with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from compartmentalization, from the ability to step outside yourself and observe your own destruction like it was happening to someone else. She read the notice once, standing at the edge of the crowd, her face a mask that revealed nothing, not anger, not shame, not the sound of a childhood spent learning to absorb punishment without flinching. She continued to her shift. The rumor spread like sepsis through the hospital. By evening, it had metastasized. She'd been fired from her last hospital for falsifying records, she'd bribed someone to get her nursing license, she was dangerous, she was a fraud, she was everything that looked clean on the surface but was rotting underneath. Mercer had done his work with surgical precision. He'd planted seeds in fertile ground, the natural suspicion people had for anyone competent enough to threaten the hierarchy, and watched them bloom. That night, at 18:30, Natalie checked Torres's vitals for the evening rounds. His oxygen saturation was stable at 94%. His heart rate was down from the morning. He was improving, recovering the way young combat medics do, with the kind of biological resilience that comes from a body trained to heal itself under conditions of extreme trauma. She was adjusting his foot drip when Torres's voice reached her, hoarse and low, "I know that suturing pattern. Who taught you combat surgical technique?" The question landed in the quiet of the bay like a grenade without a pin. Natalie's hands froze for a fraction of a second, 1/10 of a second, maybe less, just enough time for the neural pathways of recognition to fire, and then she continued her work. Her fingers resumed their motion. Her expression remained neutral. "I don't know what you mean," she said quietly. "Ramadi, 2007. Torres whispered. "Different unit, but I saw that technique. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. We trained with your people." His eyes held hers. "That's a Special Forces medic suturing pattern. Only people from the regiment stitch like that." Natalie met his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. In that time, a conversation happened without words, a recognition of shared trauma, of combat zones, of the kind of wounds that never fully close. She saw herself reflected in his eyes, someone who'd survived Ramadi, someone who'd lost people there, someone who understood the weight of what it meant to hold a life together with your hands. Then she looked away. "You're mistaken, Sergeant," she said, and something in her voice, something in the precise military use of his rank, the word *Sergeant*, which she shouldn't have known, which no nurse should have used without him telling her, made Torres go very still. She finished checking his drip and stepped back from the bed. Rest, she said. Your oxygen is stable. You're improving. She left before he could ask another question. But that night, as she was charting in the medication room, she heard her phone vibrate in her locker, the burner phone, the one with the classified Pentagon direct line that she'd sworn she'd never use again. A text from an unknown number, * call when secure. Priority flag on your file. The words meant only one thing: someone official knew she was here. Someone official was watching. And then, at 0200, while Natalie was charting on the 3rd floor, the alarm screamed. The alarm screamed at 0200 hours. Natalie was 3 floors up, charting vitals in the medication bay, when the overhead intercom crackled. Code blue, ICU Bay 4. Code blue, ICU Bay 4. Her hands went still on the keyboard. Bay 4. That was Torres. She moved before conscious thought could catch her. The stairwell door swung open, rubber-soled shoes hitting the concrete steps with military precision. 1, 2, 3, 4, each footfall a rhythm her body had learned in a different life. Her legs carried her down 12 steps, through the ground-level corridor, past the break room where a nurse was microwaving coffee at an hour when only the dying kept schedules. The ICU entrance doors parted, and she saw him immediately. Torres lay motionless on the bed, his chest heaving in that distinctive pattern of a compromised airway. Shallow. Frantic. Wrong. His oxygen saturation was dropping, the monitor's rhythm telling the story her eyes already understood. His lung had collapsed, air trapped between the visceral and parietal pleura, compressing his heart, suffocating him from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. The code team was still 3 minutes out. She knew because the overhead speaker crackled their ETA as she crossed the threshold, and because she'd timed 1,000 emergencies before. 3 minutes was forever when a man was drowning in his own collapse. Her hands moved without asking permission from her conscious mind. Muscle memory wasn't rebellion, it was salvation. 40 battlefield saves in a combat surgical tent with nothing but a headlamp and a prayer had taught her that hesitation was death. She was already reaching for the supply cart, her fingers finding the 14-gauge for catheter before the charge nurse even realized she'd entered the bay. Call respiratory, she said, voice level as still water. The charge nurse, a woman named Diane who typically avoided Natalie since the rumors started, froze. Now, Natalie added. Not anger. Not emotion. Just the voice of someone who'd made this particular call in a war zone and watched people die when it went ignored. Diane moved. Natalie's eyes found the landmarks on Torres's ribs. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomy lived in her hands, in the muscle memory carved into her nervous system during months of training that had never officially happened, for an operation that the Pentagon had classified so completely that it might as well have never existed. Ramadi had taught her that she could find the human body's secrets in the dark with only her fingertips. The light above Torres's bed was fluorescent and cold. She needed 2 seconds to locate the exact point between his ribs where air was trapped and death was waiting. She found it. The needle went in at 45 degrees, smooth as intention, and the moment the catheter breached the pleural space, the trapped air came screaming out, a hiss like a pressurized vessel releasing, like oxygen itself was gasping in relief. The sound was pure physics. Pure salvation. The hiss that meant his lung could expand again, meant his heart could beat without obstruction, meant Torres got to keep breathing. His oxygen saturation climbed immediately. The monitor's rhythm changed from frantic to possible. 75%. 82%. 88%. His color returned like someone had reversed the clock on his exsanguination. His eyes opened. His body stopped that shallow, drowning heave and began drawing air the way lungs were supposed to. Stable. The code team burst through the doors at 0203, running hot, ready for resuscitation that was no longer necessary. Their steps thundered across the tile, but by then Torres was breathing on his own. His eyes were tracking. His fingers moved. Natalie stepped back from the bed in one fluid motion, setting the needle on the sterile tray beside her. Her face bore the expression of someone who had just filed paperwork. No excitement. No triumph. No visible remnant of the fact that she'd just read a dying man's anatomy like scripture and saved his life with her hands. Dr. Mercer arrived 30 seconds later. He took in the scene in a single sweeping glance, Torres breathing. Natalie standing 3 feet from the bed. The decompression needle on the tray. The code team stepping down, their urgency no longer needed. His jaw tightened as if something inside him had broken. "What did you do?" His voice was clinical. Precise. The voice of a surgeon who was already calculating. The charge nurse from the code team answered before Natalie could. "Needle decompression. Second intercostal. This nurse performed it before we arrived." The words hung in the ICU like a verdict. Mercer's face hardened into something that resembled marble. He didn't look at Natalie. He looked at her the way a prosecuting attorney looks at evidence of guilt. "That's a physician procedure," he said quietly. "You've confirmed every concern I've raised about credential scope violations." He turned to the charge nurse on shift, the one with the clipboard. "Document this," he said. "Every detail. This is going in her permanent file." Torres tried to speak then, his voice rough as gravel and twice as determined. "She saved my life." The words came out fractured but clear. "That suturing pattern. That technique. She's—" "You're in no condition to assess medical appropriateness," Mercer interrupted, his voice smooth as oil. "You're post-emergency, under medications, and potentially suffering from hypoxic confusion. Your opinion on clinical methodology isn't relevant." He left the ICU without another word. Natalie didn't watch him go. She was already documenting the vitals, her pen moving with the same precision her hands had used 3 minutes earlier. The time. The procedure. The oxygen saturation curve climbing back to normal. Every detail rendered in official shorthand. Neutral. Invisible. The kind of documentation that could be used as evidence against her or proof of her competence, depending on which way the wind blew. The shift ended at 0700 hours. She showered in the staff locker room, her scrubs becoming ordinary hospital laundry, the antiseptic smell of Cedar Creek medical washing away and being replaced by something that was just soap and thyme. She dressed in the plain clothes she always wore, black pants, a grey sweater, nothing that announced anything about anything. She braided her hair, clipped it back. Made herself unmemorable. Then she opened her locker and looked at the folded flag. It was small enough to hold in both hands, a triangle of red and white folded into precise angles the way military funerals folded them. Captain Sarah Chen's flag. Her best friend. Her second-in-command during the Ramadi operation. The flag had been delivered to Natalie's apartment by a liaison officer with sealed orders and instructions to keep it classified. Officially, Captain Chen had never served. The operation had never happened. Natalie Hayes had been buried so deeply that she'd stopped existing the day she'd accepted medical discharge and disappeared into the civilian world. She touched the flag once, the cotton fabric cool under her fingertips. Then she closed the locker door and walked out into the main hospital corridor. Dr. Mercer was waiting. He stood near the exit doors with 2 security guards flanking him like bookends. His tablet was in his hands, and his expression carried the satisfied confidence of someone who had maneuvered every piece into position. She could see the screen from 6 feet away, emails displayed in their little grid, subject lines visible even from distance. His smile was the smile of a man who believed he'd won. "Captain Hayes," he said, using her rank for the first time, the word landing with sarcastic precision, "we need to discuss your employment status." She stopped walking. The security guards moved slightly, positioning themselves to ensure she wouldn't move past them. Hospital security. Not police. Not trained for this kind of confrontation. Just men paid to stand between the building and the problems the building wanted to remove. Mercer held up the tablet. "I've sent formal documentation to 3 board members. A detailed report to the state licensing board regarding credential irregularities." He paused, letting each word land like a hammer strike. And I've retained a private investigator to verify the allegations. The screen showed an email thread. His signature alone, over and over. Cease it to hospital administration. Cease it to the Colorado Board of Nursing. Cease it to attorneys whose names she didn't recognize but whose letterhead suggested they specialized in professional destruction. The combination of your suspected credential fraud, Mercer continued, his voice warm as hypothermia, along with last night's scope violation, performing a procedure outside your licensure, leaves us no choice. He took a step closer. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending a full investigation. The words came out measured, professional, final. Security will escort you out. Your badge will be collected at the front desk. You will not return to this facility pending the outcome of the investigation. He stepped even closer. I've worked very hard to protect Cedar Creek Medical's reputation, he said softly. The kind of soft that carries threats. I suggest you don't fight this. There are witnesses. There are records. And there are people far more powerful than you who have vested interest in seeing your career end. Natalie's hands did not shake. Her voice, when it came, was the color of still water. I understand. That wasn't what he expected. His smile faltered, just fractionally. He'd been braced for argument, for anger, for the kind of emotional response that would justify his narrative that she was unstable, unfit, a liability masquerading as nursing excellence. But her face was carved from stone. Her composure was a weapon he couldn't penetrate. Your badge, he said, recovering. Front desk. Now. The two security guards moved in, not aggressive but clear. Natalie walked between them without resistance, her head level, her shoulders back, moving with a kind of controlled precision that made the hallway seem to part in front of her like a crowd that had sensed something larger than itself approaching. The entire ICU watched in silence. Nurses paused mid-charting. A physician glanced up from the medication cart. Even the machine seemed to hold their breath. She reached the front desk. Handed over her badge to the administrative assistant, a young woman named Sarah who'd always been kind to her. The badge was attached to a lanyard with a Cedar Creek Medical logo. Natalie removed it slowly, held it for a moment, then placed it on the desk. Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered. Natalie said nothing. She turned toward the automatic exit doors, and they parted for her the way they'd been parting for her every single day for the past 5 years. But this time, when she walked through them, the security guards followed her to the parking lot to ensure she actually left. The Colorado Springs dawn was cold. The air smelled like rain that was coming but hadn't quite arrived yet, that electrical charge that meant a storm was building. Her car was in the second row, a gray sedan that was the automotive equivalent of invisibility. She sat in the driver's seat with her hands on the steering wheel and didn't move. Through the hospital windows, she could see into the ICU. Could see the bay where Torres lay breathing, his lungs expanded, his heart no longer crushed by his own body's betrayal. He was alive because she'd moved fast enough. He was alive because 40 battlefield saves had written their lessons into her muscle memory so deeply that even 5 years of invisibility couldn't erase them. And now Torres knew exactly who she was. Which meant Dr. Mercer's investigation was about to discover something that would make his carefully constructed case collapse like a tension pneumothorax meeting a needle. But Torres would have to choose whether to speak, whether to reveal the truth that Natalie had spent 5 years burying. Whether to risk saying the words out loud that would change everything. The question wasn't whether Mercer would destroy her. The question was what would destroy him when the truth finally surfaced. She started the car and drove out into the pre-dawn darkness, the hospital shrinking in her rearview mirror. Her phone buzzed against the seat. Once. Twice. 3 times. She didn't check it yet. But that wasn't the worst part. When the shift ended at dawn, Dr. Mercer was waiting in the corridor outside the locker room, tablet in hand like a surgeon holding a scalpel. Natalie saw him before he saw her, the set of his shoulders, the way his thumb scrolled through documents with the precision of a man preparing for execution. She kept walking. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Captain Hayes. He'd never called her that before. The word fell between them like a gauntlet. She stopped. Turned. Her jaw tightened fractionally, the only tell she allowed herself. His smile was sharp as surgical steel. Thought you might want to see what I've prepared. He turned the tablet toward her. The screen glowed with subject lines. Emails to 3 board members. A formal complaint to the Colorado Medical Board. A private investigator's preliminary report, 17 pages thick. 5-year employment gap, Mercer said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. No verifiable credentials before 2019. That's quite a hole in your story, Natalie. She didn't look at the tablet. She looked at him. Her hands remained at her sides, palms open, the surgical calluses visible on her fingers, evidence of work, of precision, of hands that had saved lives. Those hands did not shake. The board meets in 1 hour, he continued, swiping through documents. They've already seen these files. The state licensing board has been notified. And the investigator's preliminary findings are damning. He paused, letting the silence stretch like an ether mask over her face. You're suspended, effective immediately, pending investigation. Security will escort you out of Cedar Creek Medical within the hour. Natalie's voice came out flat, measured, a voice that had commanded men under fire. I'd like to see a copy of the complaint. You'll receive it through legal counsel. He turned away, already dismissing her. There's nothing you can do, Natalie. The machinery is already in motion. By tonight, your name will be flagged in the National Nursing Database. By tomorrow, no hospital in Colorado will touch you. She watched him walk down the corridor, his shoes clicking against the tile with each step, the sound of a man who believed he'd already won. Natalie didn't follow. She went to her locker, removed her badge, and placed it on the shelf beside the folded flag, the one she'd kept hidden for 5 years, the flag that had draped Sergeant Ramos's coffin, the flag that represented everything she'd promised to keep buried. At 6:56 a.m., security arrived. 2 men in polo shirts with security patches, professional and indifferent. They didn't speak to her as they walked her to the exit. The lobby was empty at that hour, just the night nurse at the desk pretending not to watch, and the fluorescent lights overhead casting everything in shades of gray and white, no color, no warmth, no mercy. The door slid open. The smell of Colorado early morning, pine and thin air and the approaching heat of a June day that didn't care whether she had a career anymore. She walked out into it, past the loading dock, past the ambulance bay, toward the employee parking lot. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. The trembling that had started somewhere around her ribs wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the accumulated weight of 48 hours of watching everything she'd built collapse under the precision of a man with a network and a vendetta. The diner was 3 blocks from her apartment, the kind of place that stayed open all night for insomniacs and night shift workers who didn't want to go home yet. She'd never been there before. She sat in a booth with cracked vinyl seats, under fluorescent lights that buzzed like a swarm of insects, and ordered coffee from a waitress whose name tag read Dolores. 3 o'clock in the morning. The coffee arrived steaming. Natalie stared into it as it cooled, watching the surface tension change, the slight film form as heat dissipated. Pain is data, she'd learned at the 160th SAW medical training course. Every sensation contains information. But this was just absence. Just the ghost of a woman in the window glass beside her booth, a woman whose face had become a classification, whose service had been declassified into non-existence. Ramadi lived in that reflection. The rooftop. The weight of the rifle. The sound of rounds hitting the cinder block barrier she was using for cover, each impact sending dust into the air like a visible heartbeat. 11 hours. 43 combat surgical procedures performed with supplies meant for 8. Sergeant Ramos bleeding out despite her hands, steady hands, surgical hands, hands trained at Walter Reed to save lives in the worst conditions, because some wounds are too big for medicine to fix. She'd promised him in those final seconds, promised she'd disappear, keep the mission buried, not let his death mean nothing by letting the Pentagon's secrets into daylight. And she'd kept that promise. 5 years of being nobody. 5 years of accepting erasure, of building a life where Captain Natalie Hayes didn't exist, where she was just a nurse with competent hands and no history. 5 years of silence. 48 hours for Mercer to destroy it. The waitress refilled her coffee without asking. Natalie didn't touch it. At Cedar Creek Medical, in the ICU, Torres was sitting up for the first time since the needle decompression. His daughter Maria sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, her eyes red from crying, the good kind of crying, the kind that means the person you love is still breathing. A nurse was checking his vitals, noting the oxygen saturation on the monitor, 98% and climbing. "Where's Natalie Hayes?" Torres asked. His voice was rough from the intubation tube, his throat raw, but there was steel underneath it, the voice of a man who understood what had happened to him at 0200, who understood exactly what had been done and by whom. The nurse looked away. "She's been suspended." Torres's face hardened like concrete. His hand gripped the bed rail hard enough to turn his knuckles white. "For saving my life." No answer. The nurse finished her charting and left. Maria squeezed his arm. "Dad, you need to rest." Torres wasn't resting. He was staring at the ceiling, processing, remembering. He'd recognized that suturing pattern anywhere, the same pattern he'd learned at Fort Bragg, the same pattern taught in the Special Forces Medical Sergeant course, the same precise stitch work that separated amateurs from operators. Captain Hayes. Warhawk 6. The woman who'd held a rooftop for 11 hours and lived to disappear. Dr. Mercer was in his office on the 3rd floor, composing the final email. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the velocity of someone closing a deal, someone who'd already calculated every variable and found them all in his favor. The medical director was listening to him now. The board members were on his side. The state licensing board would process the complaint within 30 days. By then, it wouldn't matter. She'd already be gone. He typed the last sentence, clear evidence of credential fabrication. Recommend permanent termination. Then he attached the investigator's report, hit send, and watched the confirmation message appear, message sent 6:52 a.m. It was done. She was done. He leaned back in his chair and smiled. 3 miles away, in the diner, Natalie watched her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back had eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic, hardened by experience, shadowed by sacrifice. That woman had held a rooftop for 11 hours. That woman had kept 43 people alive with supplies meant for 8. That woman had buried her own name and her entire identity to protect a mission the government had classified so deep that even the men she'd served with didn't know her real rank. That woman was invisible. The coffee had gone cold in the cup. She didn't drink it. The waitress came by with a refill and Natalie didn't stop her, just let the cup sit there, steam rising and dissipating, heat turning into nothing, presence fading into the air. Her phone buzzed on the table. A text from Marcus, "Mom, where are you?" She didn't answer. What would she say? That the world had caught up with her? That being nobody wasn't enough anymore, that someone had noticed, and the machinery of institutional power had already begun crushing her into smaller and smaller pieces. She paid in cash and walked back to her apartment through the pre-dawn darkness. The streets were empty. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges, the way it does before sunrise, when the world is between states, neither night nor day, neither yesterday nor tomorrow. By noon, the Pentagon would receive word that Operation Warhawk's remaining active assets had been exposed. By 1:48 p.m., classified documents would be reviewed. By 3:56 p.m., the declassification order would be prepared. And by 6:24 p.m., Cedar Creek Medical would receive a phone call that would change everything. But at 3:27 a.m., Natalie Hayes, Captain Natalie Hayes, Warhawk 6, the woman who didn't exist anymore, sat in her apartment in the dark, the folded flag from Sergeant Ramos's coffin held in her hands, and waited for the next 48 hours to unfold. The hospital lobby filled with whispers when the doors burst open and Marcus pushed through, 17 years old and carrying something that made the afternoon light change. The shadow box caught the fluorescent glow, medals arranged in perfect rows, bronze star, silver star, 2 purple hearts catching the light like accusations. His jaw was set the way Natalie's was when she was holding something too heavy, and he walked straight toward the ICU with the kind of fury that comes from protecting someone you love. Torres sat up in his bed, stable now, breathing on his own, the ventilator finally silenced 4 days ago. His eyes tracked the boy moving through the ward, and something shifted in his face, recognition that went deeper than names. When Marcus stopped at the nurse's station, when he opened that shadow box like he was releasing something that had been caged, Torres's hand gripped the bed rail. His voice came out hoarse, almost broken, Warhawk 6. The waiting room held its breath. That call sign hadn't been spoken aloud in 11 years, not since the rooftop in Ramadi when a captain with hands steady as surgical steel had held a position alone while her team evac'd. A Marine in civilian clothes stood from one of the plastic chairs, older man, weathered the way combat makes you weathered, the kind of bone-deep knowledge in his eyes that only comes from having seen the things she'd seen. He stepped forward, and when he read the citation aloud, his voice didn't waver but something in it trembled anyway. Captain Natalie Hayes, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Ramadi, when her Special Forces team was ambushed during Operation Phantom Strike, she held a rooftop position for 11 hours under sustained enemy fire, treated for wounded soldiers while maintaining defensive posture, and remained in position until extraction was secured. For her actions under fire that day, and for the 43 lives saved in subsequent medical operations across 3 deployments, she is hereby recognized. The words hung in the air like they were rewriting the room itself. Staff who had cut Natalie from break room conversation stopped moving. The nurses who'd accepted Mercer's whispered allegations about faked credentials stood absolutely still, watching Marcus hold the shadow box like it was armor and weapon both. And then the doors opened again. A 2-star general walked through in dress uniform, and the room's temperature changed. General Harrison Blackwell, Deputy Director of Special Operations Command, moved with the kind of quiet certainty that makes institutional power look like a small thing by comparison. He rendered a salute that was sharp enough to cut, fist to chest, precise, honoring, and his eyes found Dr. Mercer standing near the ICU nurse's station. Dr. Mercer, the general said, and his voice was calm the way a still ocean is calm before a storm moves in, the Pentagon is very interested in how a recipient of the Distinguished Service Cross ended up suspended from clinical duties. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The entire hospital had become his audience. That's a conversation we're going to have. But first, you should know that Captain Hayes' service record has been declassified as of this morning. Which means everything you've done in the last 72 hours is now documented alongside her actual credentials. The general paused, let that sink in like a blade. And there are very specific federal laws about retaliation against military personnel. Mercer's mouth opened, closed. His hands had started to shake, small tremors he tried to hide by gripping the counter, but they were there, visible, the physical manifestation of understanding that everything he'd built, all those favors and phone calls and carefully cultivated relationships, had just become irrelevant. But the real destruction was already in motion. On the other side of the city, in a high-rise office overlooking downtown Colorado Springs, a hospital board member named Catherine Cho sat at her desk and watched a video on her phone. 30 seconds of footage from the ICU 3 days ago, Dr. Mercer stepping between Natalie and Torres's bed, his voice dripping condescension, perhaps someone with actual emergency medicine credentials should handle this patient. 30 seconds of Natalie's jaw clenching. 30 seconds of Torres's daughter's face crumpling. And in the corner of the frame, the barely visible moment where Natalie had performed the needle decompression that saved his life, hands moving on muscle memory from 1,000 hours of training the hospital had never known she possessed. The video had been posted by Torres's daughter, shared in a grieving daughter's rage at watching her father treated like he didn't matter, shared by someone who'd overheard Torres whisper that call sign. It had hit 500,000 views in 3 hours. The comments were a bloodbath. The hospital's social media was flooding with outrage. Someone had identified Mercer by name, tagged Cedar Creek Medical, provided the entire timeline of his attack on Natalie's credibility. Catherine Cho opened her email and typed a message to Dr. Gerald Westin. One line, "You need to see this." She forwarded the video. 43 minutes later, the response arrived. Dr. Westin, the legendary physician who'd written Mercer's medical school recommendation letters, who'd mentored him for 12 years, who'd attended his wedding and treated him like a protege, Westin's reply was 3 sentences that destroyed everything. "This is the physician you became? I watched the video. You have betrayed everything I believed about your character." It wasn't shoutware. It wasn't rage. It was the quiet assessment of a man of consequence turning away from someone he'd trusted. Westin sat on 4 hospital boards. He mentored 47 physicians across Colorado and Wyoming. One word from him, and he'd spoken that word, ended careers like burning through tissue paper. Mercer's phone became a notification feed of collapse. The state licensing board messaged him within the hour, the complaint against Natalie Hayes was dismissed, case closed, and a new investigation was opening into the complaint filer himself. His investigator sent a careful email withdrawing his preliminary report, distancing himself with the precision of a man protecting his own career. 2 board members who'd supported his suspension sent messages saying they couldn't comment further. The hospital's legal department requested a meeting at 6 a.m. He sat in his office as evening fell, and the video played on loop on his screen. He watched himself. Watched Natalie's hand stay steady, her voice never rise, her composure not crack while he'd wielded institutional power like it was infinite. Watched her perform a procedure that saved a man's life using skills no one had known she possessed. Watched the moment his arrogance had become permanent evidence. By 8 p.m., the board president called. The line was quiet, professional, final. "Richard, we need your resignation by morning. We'll provide references for clinic work. Rural settings are very different from academic medicine anyway." The click of the line going dead was the sound of a door closing that would never open again. 6 months later, Natalie pulled into Cedar Creek Medical's parking lot as sunrise painted everything gold. Her office had been prepared, Captain Natalie Hayes, RN, clinical director, on a nameplate beside the ICU entrance. She walked past staff who'd exiled her, and they nodded now, some offering quiet apologies she accepted without lingering on. She didn't need their contrition. She needed to work. In the loading bay, Dr. Richard Mercer loaded medical supplies into a van. Rural clinic work, 3 hours north, the only position he could find after Westin's disavowal had torpedoed his reputation. He saw Natalie walking past, and his hand stilled. She didn't speak to him. Didn't acknowledge him beyond a single glance that held no anger, just the weight of consequence. She walked on, and he returned to loading boxes, unable to meet her eyes. Inside the ICU, Torres took his first lap down the hallway without the cane. His daughter Maria walked beside him, and when he saw Natalie, he saluted, the gesture of a soldier recognizing command, recognizing honor, recognizing someone who'd held a line so others could live. Natalie returned it, then smiled. "The ones who have seen the worst often give the most," she said quietly, and Torres nodded, and Maria squeezed her father's hand, understanding now what this woman had sacrificed, what she'd kept hidden, what it meant to move through the world carrying that weight. "She wanted you to know something. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power, if you've ever watched institutional cruelty operate unchecked, please share this story. Subscribe for more stories about the quiet heroes among us. Like this video and comment below, what would you have done in Natalie's position? How do we dismantle the systems that protect people like Mercer and silence people like Hayes?